Let me just pause and say this. It's gonna be very hard for me to review this book. Hola mi gente, MsMalcolmHughes here, and welcome back to another book review. But before we get into that, the first thing I want to say is Ramadan Kareem, and I want to wish a happy Ramadan to all of my Muslims around the world who are honoring and fasting during this holy month. Now let's get into it. So today I will be reviewing one of my all-time favorite books. Actually, it's probably my most favorite book ever, and if you know me personally, you probably already know what's coming, and y'all probably know what's coming too. But it is the Autobiography of Malcolm X as told to Alex Haley. And this is my 5th time reading this book. I have 2 other editions. I have an earlier one, and I have a most recent one up there that has this picture on it that I love because it's of him smiling. I just love that because I don't think that's what's always depicted of him. But let's talk about all my tabs. This is my 5th time reading this book, and I have so many tabs. There's so much I get out of this every time I read it. These tabs came from just this one last reading. It felt like I was reading it for the very first time. But let's get into it. As the title tells you, the Autobiography of Malcolm X is the story of Malcolm X as told to Alex Haley. It goes through his entire life, from being a very young child in Lansing, Michigan, to being in Harlem, New York, and everything that happened in between there. So we definitely get the full scope. We get from when he's young and what he's exposed to from an early age. And I think that when we think of the man that we all get to know as an adult, Malcolm X, El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, then we definitely see how so much of his childhood impacted and influenced his ideology when he was an adult. For example, so he was raised by parents, his father most specifically, but his mother as well, who were followers of Garvey, or Garveyites as they would be called. And so that unified African movement back to Africa, all of that being race pride or prideful in our race, all of that was there from a very early age. And he also witnessed his father have to go through oppression, right? Their house was bombed, or their house was set fire upon when he was younger. So having those memories of white people being so anti his father, and the message of black pride and unity and self-determination was there from a very early age. His mother was also someone who was very color conscious, so I think that played a part in it as well, of like loving yourself and black pride and all of that. I think that comes from that as well. So then we get to progress to his journey to Boston, where we get Detroit, Michigan. We get a lot of the background and history. Let me just pause and say this. It's gonna be very hard for me to review this book. I'm gonna try to keep it short and concise, but I love this book. I love Malcolm X. There's not enough that I could say about it to capture all of it. But we do get to see what makes him him, right? We get to see his then journey to Detroit. So we get all the family background, the trauma, his family being separated, how he was placed into the system, the adoption system, and how him and his brothers and sisters were separated. So we get all of that. And then we get that him being older and going to live with his half-sister Ella in Boston, and getting that experience and how that changes him significantly, right? Visiting her and then living there, and then how he kind of gets into the scene, right? How he becomes more of a womanizer there, gets into drugs, different things by being on that scene, and then how everything is escalated significantly once he moves to New York. And outside of everything he gets into in New York and Boston, he also learns some very valuable lessons then as well, right? Outside of like the street lessons he learns people. He learns how to read people during that time. I think also he begins to get a full understanding of himself, and that he's charismatic, and we get to see him navigate so many different worlds and learn so much. And it was just so much here to unpack, right? I love this section of the book because we get to see the humanity. I think people have always noted this, but as much as Malcolm X critiqued others, he used that same critical lens upon himself. So when he's looking back and telling these stories, it is not from a lens of self-removal. He's fully aware, he's fully in it. He tells these full stories, but also he does a brilliant job of really making you feel like you're in it. You get the lessons, you see the journey, you're rooting for all of these individuals, and you get to see how all of this is shaping the man that he will eventually become. So from there, he does go to jail, he does go to prison, right? And then that's when we see the shift, right? First he's called Satan because he's very anti-religion, very anti-God, very mean-spirited, you could say. But he's also still very outspoken, right? That's one thing you always see about him throughout his whole life. Very outspoken, very intelligent. Lost a lot of that by being in the streets and not reading, not being learned. He talks about that. But in prison, he says that outside of the university, that is like the best place to study because you just have the time. You don't have the distractions of life and other things. So for him, that's where he got his real knowledge, right? The library that he was exposed to. And he actually during that time got to go to a different prison. Initially he was in like a regular prison, but then his sister was really petitioning for him to go to a more lenient prison. Now prison is still prison. It's, I'm sure, being in cage anywhere is not a pleasant experience, but this one was more lenient, had more resources, and had an amazing library from a millionaire who had donated his library collection upon his death. So just access to resources and all of these things, he had it there. So he learned so much, he studied, began debating, right? And then his brothers, his family was still trying to get him to join the NOI and listen to the ideas of Elijah Muhammad. And at first it wasn't going through, but then his brother put it to him in a different way, more of like a scheming type of way. Was like, I know how to get you out of prison. And eventually that worked because it sparked Malcolm's interest, especially where he was mentally at that time. So as the story goes, historically, you know, he joins the NOI, you know, he becomes the most prominent minister in the NOI, part of that movement. I once read someone's review and they were saying how the NOI didn't make Malcolm, Malcolm made the NOI. And I think that's a very valid statement, but I think that what Malcolm would say is, and what he said here, is that they saved each other, right? So Elijah Muhammad definitely had a messaging that rang true for him and helped to get him disciplined and on the right path. And I think that he took that message and he saw the potential there and the way in which it could help his people, could help us, could help black people, and he went full throttle behind that 10 million%, right? So I definitely think that the NOI would not be what it is today had it not been for Malcolm X pushing it the way that he did, going out and recruiting people the way that he did, being such a voice for it, right? And with that, I think that's one of the things that's so heartbreaking for me reading this book. Just know that I cried 3 times reading this book. Is that seeing how dedicated he was and watching the roots of jealousy and envy and insecurity be the bedrock of division is very hard. Because even just looking at old interviews and reading speeches, there was never a time when it wasn't the Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us. But like, it was just always there. And so to know that the roots of division were rooted in jealousy, insecurity, it's painstaking to read that and to see how dedicated he was to the NOI and to Elijah Muhammad most specifically. And also to read this book, you see a lot of the traumas from his childhood, and to know that so much of what had been done historically to his family at the hands of white people was done to him by black people within the NOI. But don't misconstrue what I'm saying. It wasn't just the NOI, it was definitely the US government and other parties as well, either being directly involved or allowing certain things to occur, right? So it's hard because then you're getting it from all sides, right? And that, I think, just pains me so much to see how it all ended up. for Malcolm and the NOI and the black people within that movement. That's very hard, and that was also very hard for Malcolm. And that'd be hard for anyone. You dedicated 12 years of your life to this, right? So on multiple levels, that's just hard to get through and to rationalize. And you know the long-term impact of that, and you know the end result of that division. So that's hard, but I think taking away from that and moving beyond that, we also get to read so much about his time when he goes to Mecca. So his time abroad internationally, first from Mecca, but then also visiting many other African countries and other nations as well, meeting with so many heads of states, and the way in which he unified all movements as far as the liberation of people rooted in black people and getting support for black people from so many others in the world, and this plan to take the US before the United Nations with all of these other heads of countries, prime ministers, others from other countries rallying behind the fact that the United States has committed crimes against humanity, against black people in America for the way in which we were treated. Brilliant. And I think that's still brilliant. Some people would say ahead of his time. A brilliant plan, necessary plan. I think that other people have gone before the United Nations, but I think that piece is missing. That unified front is missing. I've been reading so much recently and just listening to so many talks about how black people have to put ourselves back in world history, right? Or not even put ourselves back in it, but recognize our place in it, right? So much of what we are taught and what we learn is rooted in our time in America, and that's not it. That's not it. We have a rich history here of what we've created. I will never knock that. Super proud of that. I don't care for what anyone says and where we are. We are people who have persevered and endured. And I think collectively we are still striving and in many ways thriving, so I will never take away from that. But our history is not a USA history. Our history is world people. We are throughout the world, and I think we have to acknowledge that. And I think that that's what Malcolm never lost sight of, right? That unified front, that international front. Because if you were only fighting here, you were losing the battle. You were already behind, and that's something he understood, something he pushed. And I think that's something that we have to be reminded of and grapple with and continue to understand and act accordingly because of that. This book for me is brilliant. I think it's so brilliant because we get to see a full story. For me, I've always said this since I was younger. Malcolm X's story is a story of the quote-unquote pull yourself up by your bootstraps that I will never understand. Well, I completely understand, but in my mind, Malcolm X is an American success story if you want to present it that way, right? I'm not making that argument. I think he's so much more than that. And as what I just stated, he was a liberation fighter for black people and people around the world, but always never forgot about black liberation. So I think that that's super important, and I think that getting to see his full story is important, right? Getting to see where he started, where he ended up, his thinking. And I think one thing that must never be forgotten is Malcolm X always knew how much his life was in danger, but he stayed here and he fought for the liberation of black people, the unification of black people. And I think seeing such a sacrifice, how one got there, and the speech from Ossie Davis at the end, and Alex Haley giving his thoughts on how he's never met anyone like him. So much so that it's hard for him to even understand, or it was hard for him to even accept that he was dead. He just felt as if he had gone on to the next part of his journey, and history would have to catch up and report it one day. That's how alive he was to him. And Ossie Davis, which has been cemented and repeated so often, right, our black shining prince. But he also states here, whether or not you agree with Malcolm or disagree with Malcolm, or if he scared you because he was so much of what you were scared to be, because you were trying to appease white people and navigate this world, right? I'm not here to judge people. But one thing that everyone agreed upon, or no one could argue with, was that Malcolm X was a man, and the fullness of what that means. That's bravery, right? That is liberation, and that's freedom. And he wanted all of us to be free, and he fought for that. He fought for it unapologetically, and he was honest and unabashed. And I think I've said this a ton of times, this book is probably one of the most impactful books of my life. It's shaped so much of my life. and reading it again as an adult, I just see so much here. But also I think I see other things too, right? The human factor. Malcolm X was hilarious. I don't think people know that, right? Like when you read this book, you're like, he is funny. And I think that for me, I think I had deified him for so long that you take away the humanity of it. And I think it's actually more beneficial to see him as a man in all of the fullness, as a human. I think the story is more impactful, more relatable when you do it that way. Because he had flaws, right? He was a pimp, drug dealer, numbers runner, right? He definitely talks about hitting a woman at some point in this book, right? And you understand all of the full humanity, and he never shied away from it, ever. I think that's powerful, right? To know yourself and your ownness and to use that. But all of that only is even more profound once you see the full scope of who he became. So for me, this book is a masterpiece. For me, this book is brilliant. For me, this book is necessary reading for everyone. Come on now, if you know me, read it now, read it. Come read it. Yesterday, should have been read it. Read it again. Read it right now. That's all I can ever say. But there's so much here, so much wisdom here. The writing, Alex Haley says, as much as he could, he didn't try to interpret it. He just told what he wrote what he was told. Obviously, there are editors and other things, but that honesty, and I feel like you see Malcolm through and through. And I love to see the trajectory. I love to see the journey of how it started and how it ended up and who he became. I think this book is groundbreaking and amazing. And I was at the park reading this one day, and some guy was walking by, and he's like, is that Malcolm X? And I was like, yeah. He's like, I love that book. I was like, I love it too. He's like, dang, you making me want to reread it. And I was like, you should. But that's the impact of this book. It's brilliant, and if you haven't read it, you haven't read it, you're missing out. And so much of his philosophy and ideology is still relevant today. It will never not be relevant as long as there are oppressed people in the world. So read it. I would just love to hear how this book has impacted y'all. I could talk about it forever, but I won't. As you all know, this is a part of my Year of Malcolm X series. I'm reading a lot of books on, well, 9 books, not a lot, there's so many in the world, but 9 books based on the life of El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, or Malcolm X, or there's another name that was given to him that means the son who returned. So just read the book. So with continuing my Year of Malcolm X, as you all know, reading a number of books, and the order is, what did he say about himself? What did his family say about him? What do others have to say? So keeping with what did he have to say about himself, going from the autobiography to the Diary of Malcolm X. This is one of the books that I'm currently reading, the Diary of Malcolm X, and reading his thoughts and journeys. I've started already, and this definitely just amplifies the autobiography, because so much you read there are his own words, unedited, right? So it's like, it brings it to an even higher level of understanding and intimacy. So definitely, this is kind of impossible to get your hands on, but if you find that you can, definitely get it and read it, and I'll be reviewing this soon. And since I'm here, I wanted to share with y'all the books I'm reading. That's one. Here's the other one, Dominicana by Angie Cruz. I started reading this. I wanted to share that I'm reading this because this is a book that was good from the first page. It's kept me, it's very interesting. That doesn't always happen. Some books are slow burns, but I'm really invested in this story and want to see what ends up happening. I hope it stays this good all the way through. That's it. The other books that I've told y'all I was reading, I am still reading those, just at a slower pace, and book reviews for those will still be coming. I'm reading a lot of books this year as always, but really being more intentional this year about what's getting time and when. But that is it for me, y'all. As always, I'm MsMalcolmHughes, one who believes that books are sometimes better than people. And until next time, I hope that you all are being kind to each other, as always. So continue to give time, and remember to have the best day of your life on purpose. Odabo, peace, adios, salam.